Peasants rising to knighthood through courage and skill. Commoners earning their spurs on battlefields. Social mobility through martial prowess. Hollywood has turned knighthood into meritocracy where talent and bravery overcome birth and wealth. The reality was crushing economic barrier. Becoming a knight required wealth equivalent to $500,000 to $1 million in modern terms, just for the initial equipment. Maintaining knighthood cost more annually than most people earned in lifetimes. Real knights were born into wealthy families who could afford decades of investment before the knight ever fought his first battle. Medieval knighthood wasn't military rank you could earn, it was economic class you inherited. The armor, weapons, horses, training, and ongoing costs created barriers that made social mobility essentially impossible. Once you understand the actual economics, every movie about peasants becoming knights becomes fantasy, where money somehow doesn't matter. Stand watching a boy begin knight training and you'd see the investment starting before he could walk. You'd understand that knighthood required wealthy parents willing to spend fortunes on a child's military education. The page service started at age 7. You'd watch wealthy families sending sons to live with lords who'd train them. This wasn't free. The family paid for the privilege. Room, board, education, equipment, all costs borne by parents. A lord training your son was doing you an expensive favor you paid for through gifts, service, and ongoing financial relationship. The basic education required wealth. You'd see pages learning to read, write, speak multiple languages, education that required tutors and time. A peasant child was working in fields at 7. A noble child was studying Latin, French, and courtly behavior. The opportunity cost alone excluded common families. The equipment started accumulating early. You'd watch pages receiving training weapons, wooden swords, practice lances, small shields. These weren't toys, they were expensive training tools. A peasant family's annual income wouldn't cover a year of a page's equipment needs. The horse training began immediately. You'd see young pages learning to ride, care for horses, understand equine behavior. This required access to horses, expensive animals that needed feeding, stabling, and maintenance. A family that couldn't afford one riding horse couldn't afford training a knight. The social education was critical. You'd watch pages learning behavior that marked nobility, how to eat at high table, courtly manners, social expectations. The cultural capital required to function as knight was taught from childhood. A commoner who somehow got armor would be immediately identified as fraud by his behavior. The failure rate was high. You'd see pages who couldn't master riding, weren't aggressive enough, lacked coordination, or simply didn't want military life. Wealthy families could absorb these failures, send the boy to church or give him land. Poor families couldn't afford trying in the first place. Becoming a knight started with being born into family that could invest 20 years and enormous wealth into maybe producing a warrior, with no guarantee of success. Stand watching a teenage squire and you'd see costs escalating toward the massive investment of actual knighthood. You'd understand that most boys who started as pages never became knights because their families couldn't sustain the expense. The squire service started at 14. You'd watch pages who'd survived initial training becoming squires to knights, learning combat practically by serving warriors in campaign and tournament. The squire maintained his knight's equipment, cared for his horses, assisted in armor, and trained constantly. The armor transition began. You'd see squires receiving first real armor, not full plate, but mail shirt and basic protection. A mail hauberk cost 100 to 200 shillings, equivalent to $40,000 to $80,000 today. This was intermediate equipment. The squire would outgrow it or wear it out before knighthood. The investment was temporary and necessary. The weapon collection grew. You'd watch squires accumulating swords, lances, maces, daggers, building the arsenal a knight needed. A quality sword cost 50 to 100 shillings. The weapons alone represented years of income for common families. And these were training weapons that might be replaced before the squire ever became knight. The horse requirements increased. You'd see squires needing multiple horses, riding horse, pack horse, and eventually a war horse for training. 3 horses meant 3 times the feeding costs, 3 times the stable fees, 3 times the maintenance. The annual cost of maintaining 3 horses exceeded what labourers earned yearly. The tournament expenses were substantial. You'd watch squires accompanying knights to tournaments, the primary training ground for real combat. Travel costs, lodging, food, equipment damage and replacement, Tournaments were expensive even for squires who weren't competing. The exposure was necessary. The cost was prohibitive for any but wealthy families. The opportunity cost compounded. You'd see squires spending ages 14 to 21 in service, years when commoners were establishing trades, building income, starting families. The squire earned nothing during this period. Wealthy families could absorb 7 years of zero return while spending heavily on training. Some squires never became knights. You'd see capable warriors who'd completed training but whose families couldn't afford the final expense of knighthood ceremony and full equipment. They'd fight as men-at-arms, skilled cavalry without the title, forever marked by economic limitation. Being a squire was proving you were wealthy enough to sustain massive ongoing investment while contributing nothing economically. Stand at a knighting ceremony and you'd see the single expense that excluded all but the wealthy from ever achieving knighthood. You'd understand that the ceremony itself cost more than most people earned in lifetimes. The armor was the largest expense. You'd watch the new knight receiving full plate armor, custom fitted, articulated at every joint, covering him completely. The cost? 600 to 1,000 shillings, equivalent to $250,000 to $400,000 today. This was the minimum for functional knighthood. Quality armor from master armorer cost more. The armor fitting took months. You'd see multiple visits to the armorer, adjustments, refinements. Each piece had to move properly while protecting completely. The labor costs compounded the material costs. A suit of plate armor represented a master craftsman's work for most of a year. The weapons were knightly quality now. You'd watch the presentation of proper sword, pattern welded or quality steel blade worth 100 plus shillings. The lance, mace, dagger, all had to be combat quality, not training equipment. The weapon collection for a new knight cost more than a comfortable house. The horse, the destrier, was equal to the armor cost. You'd see the young knight receiving or purchasing his warhorse. 50 to 100 pounds for quality destrier, equivalent to $200,000 to $400,000. Without the warhorse, you weren't functional cavalry. You were expensive infantry who'd wasted money on equipment. The ceremony expenses were substantial. You'd watch the knighting ceremony, feast, gifts to the Lord performing the knighting, payments to church, celebration for witnesses. The social requirements meant spending lavishly to mark the achievement. A modest knighting ceremony cost 50 to 100 pounds, $200,000 to $400,000 in modern terms. The support equipment added up. You'd see the knight needing tent, camping equipment, cooking gear, spare weapons, armor maintenance tools, horse tack, and spare equipment. The support gear to actually campaign with your expensive armor and horse cost as much as many people's entire possessions. Total investment to produce one knight, 200 to 300 pounds minimum, equivalent to $800,000 to $1,200,000 today. This was the floor. Wealthy families spent more for quality. Poor families could never begin to accumulate this capital. The knighting ceremony was displaying that your family had successfully invested a fortune to produce a military specialist and had more wealth to sustain him going forward. Stand with a newly made knight and you'd see that achieving knighthood was beginning the expenses, not ending them. You'd discover that maintaining knighthood cost more annually than earning it initially. The armor maintenance was constant. You'd watch the knight paying armorers to repair battle damage, replace broken straps, refinish rusted sections, adjust fit as his body changed. Annual armor maintenance cost 20 to 50 shillings, $8,000 to $20,000 today. Neglect the armor and it became useless. Maintain it properly and the costs never stopped. The horse replacement was regular. You'd see destriers dying in combat, from disease, from injury, from simple old age. A warhorse's useful life was maybe 8 to 10 years. The knight needed to replace his primary military asset regularly, at 50 to 100 pounds each time. Some knights lost multiple destriers in single campaigns. The weapon replacement accumulated. You'd watch swords breaking, lances splintering, maces bending. The equipment wore out or was destroyed in combat. Each piece needed replacing at costs that would bankrupt common families. The retinue was required. You'd see the knight maintaining squires, grooms, servants, men-at-arms. A knight couldn't function alone, he needed support staff for his equipment and horses. The retinue costs meant paying multiple people's wages annually. The campaign expenses were substantial. You'd watch knights paying for travel, food for themselves and retinue, lodging, fodder for horses, equipment repairs from campaign damage. A 3-month campaign could cost 30 to 50 pounds, $120,000 to $200,000. Knights were expected to campaign regularly. The tournament costs were ongoing. You'd see knights participating in tournaments, the training and social requirement of knightly class, entry fees, travel, equipment damage, ransom if you lost. Tournaments were expensive even when you won. Losing meant potentially ransoming your armor and horse back at costs that could bankrupt you. The social expenses were mandatory. You'd watch knights expected to maintain certain lifestyle, quality clothes, generous hospitality, appropriate gifts, support of church. The social performance of wealth was required to maintain knightly status. Annual maintenance of knighthood cost £100 to £200, 400,000 to 800,000 yearly in modern terms. This was ongoing forever. You couldn't be a knight for a year, then stop. The economic burden was permanent. Knights needed substantial income from lands or service to sustain the costs of being knights. The equipment was just the beginning. Stand watching a commoner try to become a knight and you'd see why it was essentially impossible. You'd understand that the barriers were economic and systematic, not just about individual wealth. The training gap was unclosable. You'd see a commoner who somehow saved enough for equipment discovering he didn't have the riding skills, combat training, social knowledge, or physical conditioning that started at age 7. The 20 years of training couldn't be purchased or shortcuts taken. You didn't know how to be a knight. The equipment without training was useless. You'd watch an untrained person in armor discovering they couldn't move properly, couldn't mount a horse in armor, couldn't fight effectively in equipment they'd never learned to use. The armor without decades of practice was metal coffin. The social exposure was immediate. You'd see a commoner trying to function in knightly society being identified instantly by behavior, speech, manners, cultural knowledge. The nobility could spot frauds immediately. Even if you had equipment, you didn't belong. The ongoing costs were unsustainable. You'd watch a commoner who somehow became knight discovering that one campaign consumed wealth that took years to accumulate. The maintenance costs exceeded earning capacity. One damaged armor piece meant financial ruin. The rare exceptions proved the rule. You'd hear about extraordinary cases, commoners knighted for exceptional service. These were propaganda more than reality. The church might knight a particularly valuable servant, but these men had wealthy patrons sustaining them. The self-made knight didn't exist economically. The social mobility myth served the powerful. You'd see lords promoting the idea that courage and skill brought advancement, encouraging common soldiers to fight hard for rewards that would never come. The myth of achievable knighthood kept armies fighting, while the economic reality ensured the nobility remained exclusive. Some capable fighters became men-at-arms, respected cavalry without knighthood title. You'd watch skilled commoners fighting in armor, sometimes maintaining warhorse, functioning as effective cavalry, but never achieving knighthood, because they lacked the wealth, training, and social background the title required. The barrier was absolute. Knighthood required being born into family that could invest equivalent of $1 million over 20 years in your military education, with no guarantee of success and ongoing costs that required substantial landed income to sustain. Movies show peasants becoming knights through martial skill and courage. Real knighthood required being born into wealthy family that could afford 20-year investment starting at age 7. Hollywood ignores that armor cost equivalent of $250,000 to $400,000. Real knights needed families that could purchase this as beginning expense, not lifetime goal. Films show commoners earning knighthood on battlefields. Real knighthood required training from childhood that commoners couldn't access. The skills couldn't be learned in adulthood. Movies portray knighthood as military rank. Real knighthood was economic class, with annual maintenance costs exceeding what most people earned in lifetimes. Hollywood shows individual achievement. Real knighthood required family wealth spanning generations, accumulated land income that could sustain massive ongoing military expenses. Films ignore that destriers alone cost $200,000 to $400,000. Real knights needed families that could replace these when they died, which happened regularly. The barriers weren't just wealth at one moment, they were wealth sustained across decades, starting before the knight was born, continuing until he died. Knights were born, not made, because only wealthy families could afford the investment necessary to produce and maintain one functioning cavalry warrior in the economic system that defined medieval warfare.